Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's discussion with Congressman Donald McEachin. We are thrilled to have you and he with us. We're looking forward to a great hour of conversation about COVID-19, climate change, Black Lives Matter, and so many other topics. As we wait for more people to jump on the call, I'll just let you know that my name is Chris King. I'm the president of the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia, and wanted to acknowledge our benefactor to the organization, Carlos Del Toro, longtime supporter of DemBiz. So we appreciate all he's done for the organization. And we invite you to become a member of DemBiz by visiting us at dembiz.org. That's DEMBIZ.org. And of course, like all the other organizations out there, we could really use your support to continue bringing you these free webinars that are keeping you informed and engaged with decision makers like Congressman McEachin from both chambers of Congress and around the Commonwealth. So we look forward to having you as a member, and we appreciate you joining us this morning. So wanted to get right into it. Congressman Donald McEachin was elected in 2016 to represent Virginia's 4th congressional district. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee as well as the Natural Resources Committee, and is a member of the Select Committee on the climate crisis. Congressman McEachin, good morning to you. Welcome to DemBiz. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you this morning.
Lots going on in Washington, I know, or at least outside of Washington. I'm not sure if you guys are in the
all over Washington, all over the country, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So as usual, our webinars go like this. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be choosing those as we move through the hour. So let's start with what's going on at this moment. COVID-19 is still a huge problem. We've seen some states pulling back the reopening that they started. We're seeing hotspots in Texas and Florida and parts of California and elsewhere. We've got legislation that is in progress, it sounds like, on Capitol Hill. Where are we right now in terms of legislation? We'll talk about schools reopening in just a minute, but what's your take on where we're at right now?
Well, right now, as you and your viewers no doubt know, we've passed 2 COVID-related bills, COVID-1 and COVID-2. They provided relief for people on an individual basis, relief for businesses, trying to make sure the businesses are in a position to hold on to their employees, and all those things that we're familiar with, and we can talk about at length if you want to. But what's pending is the HEROES Act, and the HEROES Act does a lot of things. It extends some of the protections that were in COVID-1 and COVID-2. I should say CARES 1 and CARES 2, excuse me. Mm-hmm. And it also provides monies for our states and our localities because we want them to be able to continue to provide services as well. We know from our experience in 2008 that if you properly give money to states and localities, you can come out of a recession a lot quicker than what will happen if you don't do that. Because obviously if you don't do that, you're gonna have lots of layoffs and people can't spend money and people aren't getting services and things just sort of spiral out of control. Mm-hmm. Right now, the HEROES Act is pending in the Senate. We really need our senators to, our Democratic senators are doing the right thing, but we need our United States senators to pick up the ball and run with it and at least do something, react to it, pass something so we can get into negotiations.
Yeah, and I guess that's code for Mitch McConnell a lot of times. What's the holdup right now?
Mitch McConnell. He has said that he wants to see how things play out. He wants to put a pause on our relief. But the problem with putting a pause on our relief is that, you guys still have a payroll. I remember that. I used to be a small businessman. You still have a payroll. There's no pause on payroll. There's no pause on business. There's no pause on making your mortgage or your rent payments to your landlord for where you conduct your business. So there's no pause going on in your life. There shouldn't be a pause going on in Congress.
Right, and in fact, it's even worse now because the uncertainty that businesses face regarding reopening or not reopening and then pulling back. So it's very, very difficult to maintain staff and supply chains and things like that at this time. That leads right into a question from Adam Weisbarth. For businesses that have lost most of their revenue and aren't able to hire back their staff, do you think there will be additional PPP forgiveness?
That's a really tough question to have because a lot of PPP forgiveness is based on you being able to hold on to your staff. The justification of it in the first instance was to make sure that we kept people employed, and as best we could keep them off the unemployment rolls. So the best I can say is I don't know. I tend to doubt it, but I've been in Congress long enough to know that just about anything can happen.
All right, and I forgot to mention that before you were in Congress, you served in both the Virginia House of Delegates and the Virginia State Senate. So you've been legislating for a long time. Wanted to move into schools. So that seems to be the next, depending on how you look at it, either hotspot or flashpoint or relief point, really, to help businesses get going again so that people won't have the burden of childcare or homeschooling at the moment. However, we're seeing more and more research come out that schools can be the biggest spreader of COVID-19, even more than gyms or bars or anything like that. What is your take on reopening schools?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure your folks understand that I defer to the localities. I'm blessed to have all my children grown. They're out of school, and I'm not faced with that decision as a parent. That being said, I think we need to be awfully careful as we open up our schools. If we can't do it safely, we shouldn't be doing it at all. I look at different areas in my district. So far, Richmond has said they're going to go all virtual. I think Henrico County said they're going to open up on some sort of staggered schedule. But if we do open up, we have to maintain our social distancing. We have to maintain the use of masks, even on the children. And so if we can do it carefully, it's fine. I certainly understand the need for parents and children to return to as much of a normal life as possible. But until we get a vaccine, we can forget about normal.
Right.
But we can reach some sort of normalcy if we practice, again, social distancing and mask wearing.
Do you have people reaching out to your office, pleading with you one way or the other on this issue?
Not too much, really. I think most folks understand that I'm a federal office holder and have zero say in this, but I do hear a lot of conversation, but it's all directed at my local government officials.
Okay. And what about a time frame for the legislation or possible legislation that we talked about? I think Mitch McConnell has said that something will get done in 3 weeks or within 3 weeks. Do you think that's viable?
It's absolutely viable. We have passed a framework that they can work with. We returned to Congress on Monday, and we are prepared to stay until as long as it takes. Quite frankly, we're set for 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks in July. We've already made arrangements to stay the first week in August if necessary. So on the House side, we're prepared. The moment he picks up the HEROES Act and reacts to it in whatever fashion that we can have a conversation about, we'll do it.
Okay. And sticking with COVID and statewide, Governor Northam announced that he is putting in place enforceable workforce protections so that employees feel and know that they have some protection if they're going to go back to work. They got to wear masks, they got to social distance. What are your thoughts on that? And how do we enforce things like that?
The enforcement question is a great question, but first let's start off with what he's done, which is, I think, just magnificent. We have been at the federal level trying to push OSHA to come up with these regulations that really apply to a COVID environment. If you look at the OSHA regulations as they are now, they don't really apply to a COVID world. And so that's essentially what the governor has done is, at least for the state of Virginia, he's put in protections that really match the times we live in, this COVID world that we live in. The enforcement would be just the way we enforce any other set of regulations in the workplace. You've got employees who can turn to look for relief by telling the government that X, Y, and Z is not happening, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, you go through the normal process of investigation, fines, or whatever remedial actions you deem necessary. So, the governor is to be applauded in doing that, and hopefully that will make workplace conditions safer as folks go back to work.
Yeah, I can tell you just as a regular guy that it's very frustrating to walk into the grocery store, for example, and see 25% of the people not wearing masks. And I mean customers, even though there are literally announcements coming over the loudspeaker that it's mandatory. So Walmart, as you know, just announced that it won't even let people in the stores without masks. And I think that's a great move, an important symbolic move as well, I think, for Walmart to be doing that. Want to get to a question from Lori McNamara. What are the prospects for support for the childcare options that we need for restarting the economy?
Good question. I have not heard a lot of discussion about that in the House of Representatives. We have, we've put out money for any number of things in order to keep people employed, in order to keep people viable economically. I don't think we're going to come up with subsidies for childcare because if we've done our job right, in other words, if you are still receiving income, if you're able to go to work, those sorts of things, you should be able to afford the childcare associated with that. And so I have a difficult time envisioning us coming up with additional monies for childcare, if that's what the questioner means. If the questioner means something different, forgive me, I'm not perceiving the question correctly. Please rephrase.
Well, I think it's just generally speaking, the burden of watching kids while trying to work, assuming you can even work from home. Childcare in normal times is almost prohibitive for, well, it is prohibitive for many families. It's so expensive. It's tough to find a provider. And I think the gist of the question is, will there be anything as part of a stimulus or related package that might address that specifically so that parents can get back to work or parents can do work from home while they've got somebody else watching their kids or something like that?
Gotcha. That has not been discussed to my knowledge. It's a good idea though, and certainly worthy of us having a conversation about, but I can't look you in the face and say, yes, that's going to happen, because we haven't, to my knowledge, we have not talked about it.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to COVID, but I want to switch gears here and talk about something else that is very recent and very relevant, which is this momentum that we're seeing from the Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. We saw monuments come down. We saw school names being changed. This moment is amazing in many ways, and it has led to some real concrete changes that past similar moments may not have. Do you see this momentum continuing? And if so, how?
Well, I think people have shown that they're going to stay in the streets until they get the results that they are looking for, and that's what's going to keep the momentum going. Certainly, there are any number of us in the Congress who are sensitized to these issues even before the George Floyd killing. So it really helps us to push legislation forward, knowing that we've got folks sort of at our backs out there in the real world, protesting and letting their voices be heard. Again, we encourage folks to do that. We encourage folks to do that in the peaceful fashion that they're doing it thus far. The thing I think folks need to understand, though, is that this is not about taking statues down, although that's important. It's not even about police brutality, even though that's important. It's really about trying to address 401 years of systematic racism that's in place in this country and trying to come up with a solution for that. And, I am hopeful because of the diversity of the people in the streets, young, old, black, white, yellow, brown. It's a rainbow coalition, literally, of folks coming together all with one cause, one purpose, and that's to make us a more perfect union.
Have you sensed a tipping point in this particular episode that maybe you didn't sense in previous episodes like this?
Well, I was born in 1961, and so the 60s are a blur. And I'm certainly not an expert on the 60s. Having said that, I do believe this is a different point in time because of that coalition that I just spoke of. Even though you had good people of different denominations and different ethnic backgrounds in the 60s doing things, it wasn't this widespread. It wasn't this diverse. It wasn't this deep. You didn't have small towns in middle America that were predominantly white putting up Black Lives Matter signs. I do think this is a different point in time for those reasons.
Okay. And you're a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. What kind of internal discussions have been happening there that maybe weren't happening a few months ago?
Well, certainly the conversations were happening a few months ago, but we didn't have the fuel, if you will, to push forward. You've probably heard a lot about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Well, that act was cobbled together from a number of CBC bills that were already sort of talked about, filed, and whatnot. They were coalesced together and put forward as one bill. And so the CBC had been thinking about these things, but we needed, sadly, we needed an impetus to occur, and it did, and we were able to get that bill at least through the House.
Okay. Want to get to a question here from Lauren Hershey.
Lauren.
I take it you know Lauren.
I know Lauren.
All right. Shout out to Lauren. I invite your comments on 1, the progression of removing Confederate monuments in Richmond throughout Virginia, and 2, the prospect for renaming military installations away from honoring Confederate officials.
Great question. Again, I would emphasize that the movement is about more than that, but the statues are coming down in Richmond. We do have, sad to say, we do have a judge who I think has been overly biased in his approach to these statues. He lives near the statues. He's got some past writings that were not picked up by the legislature prior to him going on the bench that certainly show a bias against minorities. And so we're in a difficult position with him right now. That being said, that's why we have appellate courts. I believe that things will break right on appeal. The renaming of military installations, I think, is a winner. I think it's going to happen despite the president's opposition to it. The Department of Defense wants to do it. I think the country, in fact, I know the country wants to do it. The House of Representatives has put in a rider on the appropriations bill that says no money will be spent on any base that bears the name of a Confederate sympathizer, unless and until there's a process in place for changing that name. In my district, I've talked about Fort Lee. I know a Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg, who was, there's a medal named after him for logistics. He was Chief Deputy of Logistics to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There we go, that's the name.
Okay. That's not an easy title.
It's not an easy title. At the time of his retirement, he was a 3-star, the highest ranking African-American general, and he's got Virginia ties, Lieutenant General Arthur J. Gregg. So I'm all for renaming Fort Lee, Fort Gregg. But we'll see how it goes. I know that my colleague Tim Kaine is very optimistic about our chances of success, as are other senators. So I think it's going to happen.
Okay, that's great to hear. It's long overdue. Sometimes people forget that the Confederacy lasted a grand total of 4 years, and it hasn't existed for the last 150 years. So seems like we might be overdue for those changes.
Absolutely.
All right, so I want to switch to climate in just a second, but we got a question from Elizabeth Flashner that I want to go back to COVID and that legislation very briefly if I could. So her question is, does the COVID-19 bill that passed the House have any changes to the ACA to open up the exchanges or allow for income modification to allow for the $600 extra unemployment to not count toward income for subsidies to help those that lost employer insurance? I know that's a long question and a lot in there, but what are your thoughts?
I don't believe it does that. I'd have to go back and relook at the legislation to be sure, but I don't recall that being a feature of the legislation.
Okay.
It's a good thought though, and something that's worthy of consideration.
Okay. All right. So to be continued on that one. Thank you for your question.
Chris, I don't know if it's appropriate or possible, but if that person wants to leave their information in the chat box and you can send it to us, we'll try to give them a better answer.
Sure, that'd be great. Elizabeth, if you could just write another note in there, that would be great, and I'll forward that on to the congressman. That'd be perfect. Okay, so let's switch gears again. Sorry for all the jumping around, but we got a lot to get to. You sit on two of the primary energy and climate related committees in Congress. You sit on Energy and Commerce as well as Natural Resources. And as mentioned before, you're also on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. So Vice President Biden announced a $2 trillion plan for investment in renewable energy and high-speed rail, many other components to that. What's your overall reaction to his plan?
Well, I think it's spot on. And the way you know that is the way it's been received by the so-called left. I don't really consider them left; they're part of the Democratic Party. You know that because of the way it's been received by labor. Both have received the proposal in a positive fashion. I like the way he presented it because he said that when Donald Trump thinks of climate, he thinks of hoax. When I think of climate, Biden says, I think of jobs. And that's exactly the right attitude and exactly where we need to be as a society because, yes, we are saving the planet. And from a moral point of view and of the 3 degrees that I'm blessed to have, one of which is a Master's of Divinity, I certainly adhere to moral views of the earth and its importance in our lives and the gift that God's given us in that regard. That being said, let's not lose sight of the fact that we're going to be providing a lot of jobs. Mm-hmm. As we reinvent our economy, we're going to be in a position to come up with green jobs, family-sustaining jobs, and that's going to be a great benefit to us. No one innovates the way the United States does, and we're going to have to be innovators to solve this problem. We're going to have to come up with solutions that we don't presently have, but as we do that, we'll be creating new industries, new opportunities for jobs, and new opportunities to sell that technology across the globe. So I'm excited about it. I happen to have been honored to have served on his Unity Task Force when it came to the environment. So I sat there with AOC and the Bernie Sanders people, with John Kerry as our chair, and AOC was also a co-chair, and really worked through those issues to try to come up with the very best plan that we could come up with, and he's embraced it almost completely.
And so you mentioned the Unity Task Force. In that room, how did those conversations go when you're trying to balance hopefully an aggressive plan with the realities of life on Capitol Hill? Where do you strike that balance?
Yeah, well, one of the things, let's just be real, we have to change the reality on Capitol Hill, right? Mm-hmm. And we've got to change the White House because we have to have someone who at least will acknowledge that climate change is more than a hoax. And we have to change some seats in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives to create a greener legislature. That being said, I think the plan was not as hard to craft as the media might have led you to believe, because we weren't that far apart. Where we may have been apart is in terms of a number, whether it's can we get this done by 2030 or 2040 or 2035, what's the right year? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, everyone in that room followed the science. And I think that's what's so important. You got to follow the science. If you follow the science, there really is no controversy. You might have a controversy about dollars. You might have a controversy, as I said earlier, about dates. But the basic science takes you to an inescapable conclusion that X, Y, and Z need to happen in order for us to preserve this earth.
Right, and some of the specific numbers are that Biden's plan aims to end electricity generated by fossil fuels completely by 2035 and have the U.S. be a zero net emissions country by 2050. So some interesting and aggressive goals there.
And it's all science-based. It's all science-based.
Right. That'll be a nice change when it happens. Okay, let's get to a question related here from Adam Siegel. He is asking, what do you think the implications of Vice President Biden's clean energy plan are for the Commonwealth and for Virginia businesses?
Well, I think the implications are positive. I think, the Commonwealth is already making some very serious moves towards being a carbon-free Commonwealth. I like the alliteration of that. I just came up with it.
That's
Uh,
good. That's good.
Thank you, off the cuff there. But I think we're doing a marvelous job and moving in that direction already. This past General Assembly session passed some very important legislation in that regard. Governor Northam has done some good things in that regard. We had a couple of court decisions recently in other parts of the country that convinced our shareholder utilities that maybe they need to move in a different direction. And they did so by ending the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, essentially. And as they do that, as Dominion does that, they will be investing more and more in renewables and clean energy. So I think we're on our way. I think we're going to end up being a leader for the country in that regard. And certainly we will be in a position to be very receptive of the Biden plan.
Okay, fantastic. I want to get to a question from Chris Weigard, who is asking if this plan can generate additional support by giving something back to voters.
There are plans out there that essentially give a dividend to our citizens off of carbon-based taxing and that sort of thing. We can do that. Whether we will do that or not is a matter of political will. It's not unheard of. It's my understanding that in Alaska, her citizens get a dividend check based on oil revenues. Mm-hmm. So it certainly is not a new idea. It's just being applied in a different economic sector. But certainly one of the challenges will be, if we do that, how do we do it and how do we divide up the money? And I will certainly be one who, while I'm not adverse to the idea, I also understand that we need to take some of that money, if not most of that money, and put it back into R&D, because as I said earlier, we have to have funds to be innovative. We have to be able to provide incentives for businesses to innovate and come up with these new technologies that will ultimately get us to this net zero carbon world by 2050.
Okay, and speaking of incentives, it's been interesting as we do these webinars over the past few months. The questions that have rolled in have been primarily about climate change, and that's despite all the other things that are going on right now between COVID and Black Lives Matter and 2020 election and so many other things. So it's definitely on people's mind, and it seems like the most prominent question that comes out is about carbon tax. And mm-hmm. my understanding is that Vice President Biden supports that, but it is not in his plan. Can you address that?
You would think I could address that. I think you're right. I'm not positive that he supports it, but I do think you're right that he supports it. The challenge, of course, is what form does it take and how much is taxed and who has to pay the tax. There's an old saying in the Virginia legislature, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. That's not quite as easy to do with a carbon neutral tax, right? We have some work to do with coming up with the right way to do it, making sure that the tax is precise. I'm not at all surprised that it wasn't part of his initial plan, but I do think some form of carbon tax is in our future. Okay.
And what about paying for this plan?
Well, there are lots of ways to pay for it. Obviously, carbon tax will be one of those ways, at least in terms of incentivizing folks not to pollute. Another way will be to end the fossil fuel subsidies. We spend billions, if not trillions of dollars on fossil fuel subsidies. We need to redirect those into the Biden plan, and there'll be plenty of money to do that. And of course, if we have to, and we're going to have to do this anyway, because it seems like it's always incumbent upon Democrats to clean up Republican mess. Well, one of the messes that the Republicans have made is the tax cut that went to the wealthiest 1%. We're going to need to get them to pay their fair share while we give some tax relief to middle-class folks who so desperately need it. So between all those sources of revenue, we'll come up with the money to pay for the Biden plan.
Okay. And if we zoom out a little bit and talk macroeconomics, it seems like historically the concerns or the resistance that have come from the other side, assuming we're not talking about just straight up oil lobbying or something like that, is have to do with the retraining of individuals into these new jobs, the period of time that is required to transition, the setting up of new businesses and new infrastructure, and the simultaneous closing or phasing out of other industries that may be high polluters. If you step back and you look at it from 30,000 feet, how do you reassure people that those considerations are being considered? And having been on the Unity Task Force, how much of that was discussed?
A lot of it was discussed, and this is going to be a somewhat lengthy answer, so let me apologize in advance.
Please.
When I first got to Congress, the oil industry came and sat down with me, and they started their conversation in terms of workforce. And they shared with me what they called their term, the Great Shift Change. And what they were concerned with there is that in the mid-20s, like in 4 or 5 years from now, demographically, they're going to have any number of people retire. They just hit the wall, they're going to retire. So I would make sure that the folks on this webinar understand that to a certain extent, the retraining piece is overstated, because there's a good number of folks who are going to retire in just a couple of years. That's number one.
Okay.
Number two, we are putting into place in the Biden plan, in the Castor plan. The Castor plan is the plan that came out from the Select Committee on Climate Change. We put in there monies for transitional locations, transitional towns, transitional cities. That's being defined as those areas where they were dependent upon fossil fuels. Now they're going to have to transition to another type of economy. We're providing money for that. We're providing training. We're providing incentives for businesses to locate in those areas. In a similar vein, we're doing that with what I call EJ communities, environmental justice communities, communities who have been on the front line of polluting entities for a long time. We're doing the same thing with them, giving them the opportunity to get into these green spaces, these green jobs, if you will. So we are aware that there's going to be disruption, and I'm not here to say there won't be disruption, but we're also preparing for that disruption. I don't think the disruption is going to be as great as advertised because of the Great Shift Change, but clearly there's going to have to be some retraining. And clearly there's going to have to be a transition to different types of jobs. I think what's going on already, not as quickly as I'd like to see it, but a lot of these fossil fuel industries are picking up clean energy subsidiaries to their businesses. Those subsidiaries are going to grow, excuse me, and ultimately take over the main part of those businesses. And they would do well to do that in a quick fashion, because the country's moving in that direction. The world is moving in that direction. And when that happens, usually business moves in that direction.
Sure. One thing that stood out to me about Vice President Biden's announcement was that he seemed to highlight the union component of this, that it would be union jobs that are created in many instances. What do you expect in terms of union cooperation or union pushback in either direction?
Well, you know, the things that the unions want to know is that they're going to be jobs. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't care, to some degree, they don't care what the jobs are, as long as they're safe jobs and family sustaining jobs. They just assume build a windmill as a pipeline, all things being equal. The challenge is that historically all things haven't been equal. And it's up to us as policymakers to make sure that the incentives are there and that the subsidies are there to make sure that all things are equal. But it's been embraced by unions. We were very aware of that, both at in the Castor Committee as well as in the Biden Commission. of the need to make sure that our union brothers and sisters were comfortable with the direction that these plans were going in. I'm happy to report that they are comfortable, they've embraced it, and I look forward to working with them hand in glove to make us a green society.
Okay, great. I want to get to a question from Paul Friedman. When short-term job prospects, such as building pipelines, come in conflict with addressing climate change, such as the need to reduce, not expand, our reliance on natural gas, where do you come down on that?
Repeat the question, please.
Basically, where do you come down on natural gas when things like pipelines come into conflict with climate change?
Well, we're going to have to get off of natural gas at some point. I understand the need. I understand the argument. I don't know that I completely agree with it, but I do acknowledge the argument that it's needed as a bridge between where we are now and where we're going. It is less carbon in the atmosphere than certainly burning oil or burning coal. But the days of natural gas, I believe, are numbered.
Okay, interesting. Question about the balance between the deployment of existing technologies, again, sticking with climate change here, the balance between deployment of existing technologies and opportunities for innovation.
Well, that's one of those things where we can happily say all of the above. We're going to need to deploy existing technologies, no doubt, but we're going to also need to be innovative, especially when it comes to carbon capture. As we go out and we figure out how we're going to get this carbon out of the air, because it's not enough to make sure that we have carbon sinks in place. It's not enough to make sure we're not putting carbon into the air. We're going to need to take some of it out. And so that's where that's at least one area. I'm not suggesting that's the only area, but that's one area where we're going to be able to see the need for innovation and the need for new technologies.
Okay. Anything else about the plan that you think we haven't covered? Obviously, there's going to be a lot to it. It's going to be front and center on Capitol Hill at some point, hopefully, when we've got a president, Joe Biden. But anything else that you think people need to know, or the business community in particular needs to know about how this might impact the bottom line, or other components of day-to-day life in Virginia?
I would just say that maybe the one thing that we haven't covered enough is environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And that's the notion of these communities, usually Black or brown communities or poor communities like what we see in Appalachia, who have been as I said earlier, on the front lines of dealing with polluted society, a polluted area. It might be coal ash in some scenarios. It might be rising seas. It might be black lung. It has a lot of different forms. And so one of the things that I did with Chairman Rahul Grahava, who leads the Natural Resources Committee, is we put together an EJ bill with really the help of the EJ communities in terms of having them help us write that bill, helping us understand that they know that they're a discrete community. They know what their answers are. They just need the ability to implement their answers, and they don't need us in Washington dictating to them what those answers ought to be. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for business in those EJ communities to help them clean up, to help them implement their answers to their problems. It's just going to require a business to be what American business is, which is nimble, creative, and a little aggressive to make sure that you're doing the outreach to these communities that you probably have not heretofore dealt with. But there's going to be, that opportunity is going to be there. The Vice President very rightfully puts EJ at the center of his plan. The Castor Commission or Castor Committee put EJ at the center of its plan. And it is a topic of a lot of discussion, especially on the D side, the blue side of the Capitol.
Okay, well, that is certainly an important component. And again, hopefully this all comes to pass. One last question about the political feasibility here. Is there any argument to be made to the other side to get this done? Let's assume that Vice President Biden becomes President Biden. Does it have to be just changing seats and getting majorities, or is there an argument that will actually be accepted by folks that don't support this right now?
That's a great question. I tend to think just because of the way they've behaved over the past 4 years, that we need to change seats. But there is certainly an argument to be made that just the removal of Donald Trump from the political scene will free up these folks to sort of follow their conscience or follow the election returns, whichever the case might be, right?
Right.
I mean, let's face it, there's some in Washington who follow the political winds, and Joe Biden winning certainly suggests a change in the political landscape. I can see a scenario where and it doesn't need to be a particular argument, so to speak, to change people's minds so much as a particular election changing people's minds.
This could be that election.
This could be that election.
All right, speaking of elections, we got a presidential election happening, as everybody's aware. And so you mentioned that you were on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force for Climate. One of Vice President Biden's challenges is building a coalition that brings in both moderates who may have supported, let's say hypothetically, they supported President Obama and President Trump and voted for both of them. And that's on one side. But then on the other side, you've also got the Bernie Sanders and the more progressive wing of the party. How do you see him bringing those together to build that coalition?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I think at this point, though, we have successfully been able to make peace with, as you termed it, the Sanders wing or the progressive wing of the party. I think it was a master stroke of political genius to set up these commissions. I think people were pleasantly surprised. I know I was, and I suspect my Sanders counterparts were on the other side, pleasantly surprised about how easy it was to come together on these issues, and that there really was just a difference in style, not in substance, on these issues. I suspect, while I didn't serve on the other commissions, that there were similar experiences, and so I think the party is unified in that regard. As far as the Obama-Trump vote is concerned, I think there's a lot of Trump fatigue. And I think there's a lot of Trump remorse. And, I think there's a certain segment of those voters who are going to come back. You've seen his poll numbers decline, even though they were never very high to begin with. You've seen them decline from where they were to the abysmal level they are now. And I think that's because a lot of those Obama-Trump voters are coming home, so to speak. But let's be real. There are some folks we're never going to get to. At some point, this is going to stop being a persuasion election, and it's going to turn into a get out the vote election. Mm-hmm. We're just going to have to make sure that we have the numbers to overwhelm those Trump voters who just won't budge.
Okay, and speaking of getting out the vote, I've asked this to so many people on these webinars. How do you see this election going between the Postal Service, COVID-19, this campaign of trying to undermine the idea of mail-in voting that President Trump has embarked on at this point? When it comes right down to it, how are we going to vote? Is it going to be fair? And is the Postal Service going to play a major role in it?
That's a great question. I think the Postal Service is going to play a major role. I think the president is doing what the president does, and that's being a jackass, quite frankly, because it's good enough for him to vote by mail. It's good enough for our soldiers, sailors, and airmen to vote by mail. It's good, our regular citizens, especially in the COVID environment, ought to be able to vote by mail. And kudos to our Attorney General for, in the primary process, getting our absentee ballots in such a fashion that we didn't have to get a witness to sign for that. So that was good. I hope he'll be able to do the same thing for the November election. The General Assembly is about to come into session. I hope that they'll put a little postage stamp on all those envelopes so that the people don't have to go out and even get a stamp to send back their absentee ballots.
That would make an amazingly huge difference, I think.
It would make an amazingly huge difference. And there are states that do that. This is not an original idea from me, believe me. I hope they'll do that. I don't know that they will, but I hope they'll seriously entertain that proposal. Virginia's in good shape. You know, we've taken the money given by the federal government for fair elections and we've applied it wisely. I don't know that every state has, but I am optimistic enough to know that, or to believe rather, that I believe that we'll be able to do most of our voting by mail should people choose to, and that at the end of the day it will be a fair election. But let's not get it twisted. The President of the United States will try to undermine this election. He will try to say that something went wrong when he loses, that it wasn't fair, that somebody cheated, that Martians invaded, that something happened to deprive him of his right to be, you know, the President of the United States. We just need to steel ourselves for that, prepare for that, and make sure that we win by such a margin that's a ridiculous argument.
Okay. So it's your belief that the U.S. Postal Service will be funded, viable, and available to the whole country come Election Day?
Viable and available. You know, the Republicans are doing everything they can not to fund it, but I believe there's enough money in the till for them to be viable and available.
Okay. And I think you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're on record as saying that you do not think that Donald Trump can win, or he doesn't think he can win without Russian interference. Did I get that right?
I don't know if I've ever said that, but it's certainly what I believe.
Okay. I thought I had seen it in another interview, but
You may have.
what, where are we on blocking those efforts by the Russians and any other countries that might want to interfere?
You know, from what I know, I don't know anything classified, but from what I know, we have some patriots out there who are doing their very best without the support of a whole of government approach to do that very blocking. But look, let's make sure we understand what the Russians have been able to take advantage of. The Russians have been able to take advantage of our natural, not our natural, but our distrust of each other. If we gave each other the benefit of the doubt, if we would assume that the other person across the table from us, even though they're opposed to our views or love this country, we wouldn't be so vulnerable to Russian attacks. They are playing on our prejudices. They are playing on our disbelief in each other. And so if we can fix that piece, there's nothing that the Russians can do to us.
Okay. Another question related to bringing the wings of the Democratic Party together, paraphrasing as I read it here, what will be the effect of the commissions that you referenced earlier with regard to affordable health care during a Biden administration? In other words, I think that there's a big concern about health care availability, especially with President Trump and Republicans trying to gut Obamacare, if not get rid of it altogether. And how are voters from different parts of the Democratic Party reassured that healthcare will be front and center and that it'll be affordable and available?
Well, they should be reassured because Joe Biden is an honest person, has said just that he's going to make sure that we have affordable health care. His approach is to repair, not replace Obamacare. He's open to, and I certainly support, the notion of allowing people to buy in to Medicare if they so choose. But no one should force you to give up your health insurance plan as long as it meets certain criteria. In other words, as long as it's not a junk plan. I happen to benefit from our state health insurance plan. It is outstanding. Mm-hmm. It pays for a lot of things. It's gotten me through a lot of health challenges. I certainly wouldn't want to be forced to give up that plan for anything else. So, you know, I certainly stand against Medicare for all, as does Vice President Biden. But that doesn't mean we can't have Medicare for those who want it. And for those who want it, we can certainly provide a mechanism for them to get it and to use it and to prosper from that and to be able to afford that. So that's where he's going with this.
Okay. You are in a unique position, having served so many years in the House of Delegates in Virginia and also the state Senate. Now having moved into the Congress and been there for 4 years, almost 4 years, what are the major differences in the way those bodies operate? Like what was the biggest surprise that you found, for example, when you went to Congress?
Wow. So as I think about that, I think of two things come to mind immediately: speed and depth. What do I mean by that? We do not move quickly in Washington. We're very deliberative, and probably for good reason. Instead of dealing with one state, we're dealing with 50 states. We have the opportunity, we're not under a time clock, so we have the opportunity to think and to be reflective about what we're doing, and the system is certainly set up to do just that. The General Assembly, obviously, we moved a lot quicker. You know, you had at the most 60 days, and in some years you only had 45 days to get your work done, and we moved with great dispatch to get that done. But there's a depth component to Washington that's not present in Richmond. And that is that because of your committee assignments, you are able to do a deep dive into certain areas. You are almost encouraged to become an expert in a particular area rather than a jack of all trades like you are in the General Assembly. Now, I realize that there were people who had a lot of expertise in the General Assembly, and I would be criticized for even saying what I just said, being a jack of all trades. But compared to Washington, Richmond, and I dare say the other state capitals across the country, you're dealing with jacks of all trades. Mm-hmm. In DC, the reason why I can speak about the environment with a little bit of authority is because I've been allowed to do a deep dive into it. I've been allowed to immerse myself in it. It's what I chose to do, which is a great thing. I mean, everybody in Washington chooses to be there, and they can choose to be an expert in the area that they want to be an expert in. But that ability is not, or that opportunity, I should say, is not afforded to you at a state capital that has to move in 60 days.
Right. Speaking of state capitals, there is a redistricting amendment that has been put forward in Virginia. Do you have an opinion on that?
I have a big time opinion on that.
Let's have it.
The problem I have with the amendment is this. It essentially affords the General Assembly no opportunity, zero opportunity to do anything to the plan. Let me share an example with you. There was once a General Assembly plan that passed all chambers unanimously. You might wonder, how did that happen, right? Nobody disliked the plan? It's because instead of having a 100-seat House of Delegates, it had 101 seats. Somebody screwed up. Now, if we can do that in the General Assembly, and obviously they fixed it, what's to make us think that a commission can't screw up in that fashion? But if the commission screws up in that fashion, there's no relief that the General Assembly can afford the people of Virginia. That's number one. Number two is this. My constituents don't have the opportunity to influence the process. Now, maybe we didn't have the best process to begin with, and maybe my constituents didn't take the opportunity to influence the process. Maybe they were so jaded that they just decided it was just not worth their time and they were too small to influence the process, but at least they had a theoretical ability to influence the process. And what we have now, or not what we have now, but what's being proposed, there is no opportunity for my constituents to influence the process. And I just think that's wrong. I'm not saying that the whole thing has to be done by the General Assembly. I certainly encourage folks to think about, maybe a hybrid of a proposal by this commission, subject to either amendment by the General Assembly or amendment under supermajority rules. If you're going to amend the plan, you have to have 2/3 of the General Assembly agree to that amendment. But to have this commission just give us a plan with no citizen ability to influence it, and I'm not just talking about hearings, but you put these people in a room together, they're answerable to no one. I think that's dangerous. I don't think that's very good for the body politic.
Okay. What is your prediction as to what will actually happen with that?
I don't know. It's a pretty popular idea. It may very well pass because I don't know that people think about it in the terms that I think about it in.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and leave it there. Anything else that we haven't covered, you think, that is a hot topic in Congress, or that people are approaching you on this, well, maybe not on the street, but online these days, wanting you to address more or talk about more?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it. I'll just say this to your listeners. I don't want them to blame you for my appearance, unless they like it. If they want to blame somebody, blame Jerry Connolly for introducing me to you guys.
All right.
Carlos Del Toro, thank you for being the sustainer of this organization. And to all of you all, thank you for being Democrats, and thank you all for being business Democrats. You know, I know people think that's an oxymoron, but all of us know that we're the best type of businessmen. We're businessmen with hearts.
Well, and not only that, but it's pretty clear that the economy does better under Democratic leadership, and the economy is a big and complex thing, and it can't just be reduced to lower taxes and lower regulations. There's a lot that goes into it, as we're seeing with COVID-19.
The economy does not fit on a bumper sticker.
That's right. All right, Congressman Donald McEachin from Virginia's 4th Congressional District, thank you so much for joining us and providing your insights this morning. Thanks to all of you at home for joining us as well, and for your questions. They were fantastic, and we will see you next time. Once again, you can check out our website, see all these webinars, and learn more about us, and become a member of DemBiz at dembiz.org. Congressman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.